So, as my screen is about to show you, we are going to spend our time today going through the 4 ballot proposals that will be on the general election ballot on November 8th. And of course, that is just around the corner. And so now is really an excellent time to start digging into what those ballot proposals are. So, without further ado, everyone, I'm sure, has been seeing all sorts of articles and news updates about some of the important elections that are coming up right around the corner. And so I always want to start with just a good run through of the races that are actually on the ballot. And before I do that, I just want to get a thumbs up from someone that the screen sharing is still on the right setting. Okay, thank you. Okay, so yeah, as you can see in front of you, there are about 10 races that you'll find on your general election ballot. The biggest ones really or I shouldn't say the biggest ones, but the one that has been making the most news is probably the race for governor. And so, of course, in addition to leading the state executive branch, I just wanted to, note that the governor is also the person who is empowered to either sign or veto legislation. They really do a lot to coordinate all sorts of roles that different state governments play, or excuse me, different state agencies play in things like rolling out services and programs, as well as setting budgets. And so, of course, the governor's race is a big one, but down the list are also some significant races. And so just to quickly run through those, next up, of course, is the lieutenant governor. And this person is kind of the second in command in the sense of supporting the governor's portfolio and their agenda for running the state. And then, of course, we'll have the attorney general on the ballot. And this is the person is the chief legal officer for the state of New York. Their role is to really guide and protect the legal rights of citizens across the state, as well as to provide legal counsel to the executive branch of state government. And so anytime there's an election for attorney general, that also creates a lot of buzz. And then fourth on the list is comptroller. And this role is less frequently talked about, but it is just as much of a significant one as the others, in that the comptroller is the New York State's chief fiscal officer. Essentially, their role is to make sure that the state and local governments use taxpayer money effectively and efficiently. The next two are both the state Senate and Assembly. These two houses make up the state legislature that works about year-round in Albany. And so those are some exciting races where we're seeing a lot of different candidates on the ballot this year. And later on in the presentation, we'll talk about ways to check who's exactly on your ballot for these races. But just to keep moving us down the line, out of the state elections, we also have 2 federal races. One is for U.S. House of Representatives, so the larger body of Congress based in Washington, D.C. And then most New Yorkers will also have one of the U.S. senators on the ballot this year. And then lastly, there are a number of counties that will have 2 different races for either Supreme Court justices or civil court judges. So again, this is just a quick recap of the races on the ballot. As I said, we'll spend some time figuring out how to see the candidates in these races, depending on where you live. But of course, the main topic of today are the ballot proposals that will also appear on the ballot. And so just before we dig into those, I am highlighting a way to figure out, what to expect on your particular ballot, since everyone's is slightly different depending on the election district you're in. So right in front of you, you'll see a link that we can later on post in the chat, but I really encourage everyone to fill that out because not only will it make sure that your voter registration is up to date and you know where your poll site is, but it will allow you to view the sample ballot that you will be seeing on election day, or if you go to vote early. So this is a really handy tool that I like to encourage folks to use, just so that they're able to be as prepared as possible before they head to the polls. Oops. And so without further ado, now let's really dig into what this year's ballot proposals are. So the next slide is taking a minute. So what are these ballot proposals? Well, before we talk about what each proposal could or could not do, I just wanted to take a step back and just talk about why there are 4 ballot proposals on the ballot this year. So first, one of the proposals is actually only for statewide voters. And so again, we're about to talk about what each of them are, but it's the way that ballot proposals work is that the legislature at the state level can vote as a body of government to move forward any sort of referendum, and in other words, a form of proposal that would then reach voters. And so rather than having lawmakers decide whether or not certain changes can be enacted, ballot proposals really put the power in the hands of the voters, and it gives the electorate a chance to determine the outcome of any of the proposals that appear on a ballot. And so I like to look at these as one of the best ways to figure out, you know, what are people voting on this election year outside of the candidates, because sometimes the ballot proposals, again, are really just a more accessible way to really impact policies and government decisions. And so that's why we at UNH always really like to talk to voters about not only what the ballot proposals are, but what they would do, how they came about, and ultimately what would happen if they were passed or if they don't pass. And so just to kick us off with the first ballot proposal, as you see in front of you, this one is called the Clean Water, Clean Air, and Clean Jobs Environmental Bond Act of 2022. This proposal would allow for state bonds to be sold to fund different sorts of environmental projects. As I put in front of you on the screen, the specific questions that voters are actually going to be weighing in on is whether or not the state of New York should sell up to $4.2 billion in bonds. And the goal of the sale of these bonds is to allow the state to then use the income generated from these bond sales to fund environmental protection projects. And specifically, these would include projects to do natural restoration, to build out infrastructure that supports community resiliency, as well as largely to fund new as well as existing clean energy projects across the state. The act specifically would support nearly 100,000 local family sustaining jobs in all sorts of parts across the state of New York. So not only is this ballot proposal aimed at building out the infrastructure for the state to run environmental restoration projects, but it's also doing things like creating a ton of jobs in the areas where the projects will take place, as well as, of course, the outcomes of these projects, which are really specifically focused on reducing things like air and water pollution, especially in areas most negatively harmed by climate change. The funding will also go to help fund new technologies that can help reduce pollution, help New York State become a leader in providing clean water, and the list really goes on from there. But ultimately, if voters vote yes, that would be them saying, yes, I support the state to authorize the sale of bonds to combat the impact of climate change. Whereas if someone votes no, their no vote would mean that they do not support this sale of state bonds to allow environmental projects to take place. So that's really the nitty-gritty of what this one is. We can spend a little more time talking about this after we get through all the proposals, but I just wanted to pause now and see if any questions came in so far, since I can't view the chat.
So one of the questions is, who creates ballots? Who creates the proposals?
Got it. So that's an excellent question. In the case of the Clean Water, Clean Air, and Clean Jobs Bond Act of 2022, this proposal, again, it's statewide, which means that the state legislature is responsible for drafting, creating, and pushing forward this ballot proposal. In order for a statewide ballot proposal to get onto the ballot, a legislature would have to pass a law that says the voters of New York will determine the outcome of this proposal by voting on it in a general election. The trick is that it's the legislature has to actually pass it 2 years in a row in order for anything to ultimately reach the ballot. And so in order for any sort of statewide ballot proposal to reach voters on election day, it does have to go through 2 years worth of legislative approval, and then ultimately the bill, assuming that the legislature passes it twice, that bill language gets sent to the State Board of Elections, which crafts language which appears on the ballot. And then for the city only ballot proposals, which are next up, those can come from a few different avenues, since New York City elections work a little bit differently if we're only talking about things that residents of the city can weigh in on, as opposed to the rest of the state. And we're going to spend a bit more time talking about that in a second. Was there anything else on this point before moving forward? Okay, great. So getting to the second part of that question, the election on November 8th is also a chance for New Yorkers to consider proposed changes specifically to the New York City Charter, which you could also say is our city's constitution. How did these ones get there? So in this case, the next 3 proposals actually come from an initiative that was started by former Mayor Bill de Blasio. The background on this this commission that put forth the 3 proposals we're about to talk about is mostly following the protests we saw happen in the summer of 2020. Former Mayor de Blasio kind of came out and said, let's examine what happens in communities of color that have been disproportionately affected by realities of everyday life, things like childcare, COVID, pollution, the list really goes on. And so this commission was established, again, following summer of 2020 to take a closer look, and then ultimately they were able to find that the more you find examples of disproportionate effects of things like inaccess to care and sorts of pollution, the more you find that racism is truly enshrined in every way that our city government functions, in the way that our businesses work and are allowed to become incorporated, and how our systems function across different agencies, and of course, in the very policies that govern everyday life. And so ultimately, after doing research for a year on ways that the city could not only examine disparities that exist across different communities, but eventually work to develop and then put in front of voters a number of recommendations for the city to act in order to begin addressing its long-standing history of racial inequity and injustice. So Again, in 2021, at this point, the commission was given a mandate by the mayor to review the city charter and identify those sorts of changes that would make the city, especially in the way that it sets out its governance and its charter, to be more in line with racial justice, equity, and inclusion values. So with that, the commission has put forth 3 proposals that are only on the ballot for New York City residents. And so let's go over those together now. So since we already talked about the state proposal, this is what we're calling number 2. The second question to voters is whether or not the city should add a statement of values to the New York City charter to guide city government. The question to voters specifically would be, should New York City add an introduction to the city charter? And the goal of that introduction would be to insert language before the rest of the very long document that defines a vision for a just and equitable city. And it would also direct government to correct past and continuing harms. So right now, if you look at the city charter, which again is our constitution, it does not have any sort of statement of values that guide government on how it should engage with its residents. So this particular proposal would add a vision. To do this, the commission had to acknowledge, or the commission came back to the public saying it's time for the city to acknowledge the mistakes in our shared past, and to move forward by creating a preamble that again would guide government. This proposal doesn't create any sort of action or right to action. It really just sets the stage and again drives back the overall mission of racial equity and justice to the main vision that city government uses as a framework to do all of its work. So this one actually leads very well into the next proposal, which would be to establish a racial equity office, plan, and commission. So what would this look like? When voters will be asked this question, it's going to be asking them, should New York City develop a racial equity planning process that would be run by a commission? And the goal of that would be to, of course, go back to the vision set forth in the earlier proposal to reduce and or end racial disparities that persist in New York City by creating a racial equity office. And this office would be charged essentially to work across all city government agencies in both helping them develop and carry out plans related to achieving racial justice. And we're looking at this as a proposal that would also mainly it would establish that the city is responsible for running and operating a permanent racial equity commission, one that can't be undone by future mayors, because as I mentioned before, the whole racial equity commission came about under a mayor who's no longer in office. And so at any point in time, technically this commission could be unfunded. I'm not suggesting that there's any rumors of that happening, but instead this would really enshrine it in city law that again, this commission not only exists, but it would also work across multiple agencies. And the office, lastly, it would really make sure that the racial justice work in the city has teeth. It would be going above and beyond just updating the city charter, but really, again, embedding within that document specific responsibilities and then distributing those responsibilities to key actors. And so that brings us just to what the specific yes or no vote is. And so I just wanted to recap by saying a yes vote, again, would change directly the city charter to create this commission, as well as a permanent office for the commission to work out of, and plans associated with what agencies need to do to keep on progress. And of course, a no vote would mean that the city charter does not change in this way. So moving on to the final ballot proposal for New York City voters is a question of whether or not the city should measure the true cost of living. The question to voters on this one is whether or not the city should create a responsibility to measure the true cost of living in a way that would not only provide a new benchmark for the city to use in all of its data and reporting and funding decisions, but also to inform policies and program decisions. The goal is really related to something that makes it unusual from the ways that a lot of, we know, human services contracts are guided and other sorts of decisions that relate different government supports to people, which is that in this case, if New York City were to pass it, then New York City would be looking at using something other than the federal poverty level, which is honestly an antiquated way of measuring the cost of living in a place like New York. I think what happened here is the Racial Equity Commission just wanted to formally acknowledge that in this city, we can't be basing certain eligibility requirements for different programs off of that federal poverty level. If we know that income supports are set at what it is right now, I think 2,200, we know that certain families in the city aren't able to live with dignity under those restrictions. And so this proposal ultimately goes to, again, amending the city charter to specifically require the government to produce and distribute annual reports on how much it really costs to afford basic necessities here. And whereas a no vote, again, would just not allow this measure to move forward. So, just with this one, I think something I've really been struck by is this is the first time in the nation that any city as large as New York has the opportunity to embed something like measuring the true cost of living into the day in and day out responsibilities of the city government. I think a lot of folks are interested in this one because of the data that we would be able to point to, especially in the field of human services, to really be able to make the case for higher investments in different sorts of costs that we know the government does not always fund its providers to cover. So this is the last point I had on the fourth proposal. But just to recap before we shift to some questions, again, this is the first time New York City, let alone any city in the country, has had a chance to vote on these specific sort of questions to enshrine racial equity and justice into the city's constitution. And of course, going back to the first proposal, which is the statewide one, to create new opportunities and funding streams to advance climate action and climate justice. So before we move to the last piece of the proposal, let's pause here and go over any questions folks have so far.
Yeah, Lena, there are some questions, of course. Who would be responsible for computing the true cost of living?
Excellent question. So the Racial Equity Commission that would be established under the third proposal would be the main agency responsible for figuring out and assigning the different responsibilities across the rest of the city. I believe the way the proposal is written would engage, or it would place a responsibility on the Department for City Planning to coordinate the data sharing process and working with open data. And then there's also room for the city to contract with some familiar partners like the CUNY Census Data Center. I apologize if I'm forgetting their exact name, but yeah, essentially the oversight would all live within this new body that would be created. And that agency would exist to also hold other agencies accountable to providing the data that the Department for City Planning would need to put together these reports. And the reports would come out, I believe, every 2 years to the public.
Elena, do amendments to the city charter and state legislature happen often? Are they successful?
That's a great question. I would say they don't happen frequently. As we talked a little bit about before, in order for a statewide ballot proposal to reach voters, it must pass through a body of legislation 2 consecutive years. And so that in and of itself does make it one of the trickier ways to change policy. However, for issues like, I'm trying to think of a good example, but I believe last year, one of the statewide ballot proposals was also related to environmental protections, and that had been a longstanding campaign that was able to push the legislature to really pass a bill twice so that it would reach voters. And then I would say in the city, regarding city-only ballot proposals, we actually see it a little less frequently. And that is because the city council here in New York has a slightly, I don't want to say larger role than the executive branch does, but they have mechanisms in place to change certain things about how, for example, city elections work. New York City has its own board of elections compared to the statewide one. And so in the city's case, we do see them less frequently unless the voters and the city council members have made it very clear that, you know, a certain change has to happen in a certain area. And then if the mayor is able to establish some sort of task force or temporary office, as the former mayor did with the Racial Justice Commission, that's when we see things like a proposal end up on the ballot.
There's a follow-up question on the true cost of living. What would happen if proposal number 3 isn't passed, that they don't establish a commission? How would that work with the measuring the true cost? And I imagine also that there could be, the majority could vote no on the value statement and yes on the other two. How would these things work out?
Yeah, and again, another very thoughtful question. Technically, from what I understand in reading the different city proposals, a measurement of the true cost of living can still be codified in the city charter, even if the main office that is named to lead it does not ultimately gain the approval of voters, which, as you just said, would be if, you know, for example, the 3rd ballot proposal didn't pass, but the 4th one did. The way that they are legislatively framed, as in the way that the language is written, they can be mutually exclusive given the reality of the fact that, yeah, there is absolutely a chance that, you know, maybe 2 of these pass, maybe only 1 of them. So the commission, when drafting these proposals, made sure to name other city agencies as a fallback, you know, in the case that, say, the city does not vote to establish a permanent racial equity office. And then the backfall, like, or I should say, the additional alternative is to defer the responsibility to the mayor's executive office, and then they would then reassign the responsibility to the appropriate city agency, which we're not exactly sure what that agency would be, but, you know, once the city would be required to measure the true cost of living, they would have to do it. And I would expect that if we were in a situation where, as we're saying, I think that would that's how advocates are looking at a potential opportunity for just speaking up and potentially forming some sort of task force of actual community stakeholders, as opposed to leaving it all within the hands of a city agency, whether that is the racial equity office or another one. Because ultimately our goal is to get more stakeholder input from outside government speakers. So that's one potential outcome we could see.
Elena, it looks like those are all the questions, but if anyone had a question and wanted to unmute themselves and ask, now's a good time. Looks like no takers, so back to you.
Okay, no problem. And we can keep taking questions as we go. But yeah, getting back to the presentation, now that we've talked a bit about what the proposals are, the next ask for you all is to, of course, flip your own ballots when you go to vote, so that you're able to really weigh in on those 4 questions. But then also to remind, ask, encourage your friends, your family members, your coworkers to also flip their ballot, because part of the work of doing things like ballot proposals is not only to provide an opportunity for the electorate to have the ultimate say in these policy decisions, but to encourage our neighbors to take part in it as well. And so, of course, I just wanted to give a shout out to you all for being here, because hopefully you can help us spread the word that New Yorkers should flip their ballots in this election. And that really ties us back to just the overall checklist, as I like to think about it, of things to think about with the election being less than 3 weeks away, I think. So just to share a bit about what it looks like when you go to vote, and some of this might be a refresher for many of you, but it's always helpful to have the dates. So in New York, there are 3 ways to vote. Right now, you can vote absentee. There's still time to request your own absentee ballot. You can either do that online at the link in the slide, which again, we can share afterwards. Or you can also go to your county board of elections office. There's one in every borough. And you can return your application right there, then and there in person, and then you'll receive your absentee ballot in the mail. Another way to vote is in person. New York has early voting that starts 10 days, or it runs for 10 days before any given election day. And this is just a growingly popular way to vote because, occasionally there are lines at different sorts of poll sites. And so just by distributing out the days that you're able to vote has already been having a great impact in New York, but we always want to talk about it more, make sure folks know that starting October 29th, all the way through November 6th, you can go to your early voting poll site and get everything taken care of and cast your ballot that very day. Again, that would be a form of in-person voting though, so just wanted to clarify that. And then lastly, as always, you have the option of voting on election day. And so again, if you prefer to vote in person and you want to do it the day of, be sure to go to your poll sites between 6 a.m. and 9 p.m. Those are the hours that all election day poll sites will be open. And of course, another link for you all to use or just save for handy reference if at any point you want to double check where your election day poll site is, and more. And then to recap where we are in the actual election season, unfortunately, the deadline to register passed. That was October 14th. But there's still, as I said before, there's time to request your absentee ballot. You'll want to get that in if you're doing it online by the October 24th. And then just resharing those dates for early voting, October 29th through November 6th. And then lastly, election day on Tuesday, November 8th. I also like to encourage people to double check their voter registration. So the link you see right there just allows you to type in your address and double check that your registration is still active. It's not necessary or anything, but there's just been, many years of stories of voters in New York ending up at a poll site, and for whatever reason, the poll site had changed and they weren't notified. Unfortunately, we tend to see this happen with the city and state board of elections, but just a proactive way to make sure you're going to end up in the right place is to also check where you're registered to vote to make sure that nothing has changed. So with that, I hope to see everyone at the polls in one form or another. I put my contact information up there for anyone to reach out if you have specific questions. I'm always happy to chat or share resources that I found helpful.